Hello, my name is Michael Lambert, and today I want to talk a little bit about food shortages. Now, we've all seen in the papers and on television about the shortages in the supermarkets of particularly cucumbers, tomatoes and peppers and so on. And I think a lot of people have been surprised by this. But I've been saying for, I think, 18 months now, since shortly after I started these videos, I've been saying that inevitably, as a result of Brexit, we would suffer food shortages. And there are two very, very good reasons for this. The first is that we are not producing as much food as we used to produce. And the second is that we're completely reliant upon the EU for a very significant proportion of our total food imports. And as far as the production of food in this country is concerned, until now, and for many, many, many years, market gardeners, people growing fruit and vegetables, have relied upon seasonal labour to come from places like particularly Romania, I think, who people would come here, they work for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, whatever, and they'd be well paid, they'd paid at least the minimum wage, and then they'd pay their taxes and they'd just go home. And that worked great, it worked well, and seemed to cause very few problems. I don't think many of these so-called migrant workers were child rapists or murderers, who, as Priti Patel described them. And I don't think any of them sought social security or used the NHS particularly, or tried to get council houses. They just came, worked for a few months, lived on the farm and went home again. But we've managed to put a stop to all that nonsense. And so now what these farmers are finding now, that they can't grow food anymore, they can't grow their produce anymore, or alternative, they have to find labourers from elsewhere. And so I think quite a lot of them apparently last year were bringing in people from places like Indonesia and Vietnam in particular. It makes perfect sense. Rather than have somebody fly over from a 3-hour flight away, you get somebody from the other side of the world. But anyway, they came, and it wasn't altogether satisfactory. I think in many cases, people who come across, they'd paid agents to find the jobs in the UK, and they found that they weren't earning as much money, they weren't doing the hours they've been promised, and so on. And I believe quite a few of them actually stayed in the UK and have just disappeared into the black economy, which is an option to anybody who feels like it and can't get a proper job. And so it's all a bit of a mess. But I think an awful lot of farmers have said that just isn't worth it. It is just too much problem. And what's the point in spending a fortune in planting fields with fruit and vegetables if you're not going to be able to harvest it? And we've all seen the pictures of fields of rotting fruit and vegetables, which seems quite extraordinary at a time when we're struggling. And of course, the other problem is that for farmers who grow, say, for example, tomatoes and cucumbers in greenhouses, they need heating and they need lighting during the winter. And since the supermarkets are very tough and they won't increase prices, the prices they pay, they're very reluctant to increase them. So a lot of these farmers just do the sums and they just see it's going to cost us this much for electricity and all the rest of it, and it just isn't worth it. And so a lot of them have just given up. And so we're producing a lot less food, and considering we don't produce anything like enough of our own food, that in itself is a big problem. But the other side of it is the fact that we're now a much less attractive customer for the EU suppliers. And if you imagine, for example, you're a supplier of oranges in Spain or tomatoes in Holland or something, and you're faced with two options. One is you stick your stuff on the lorry and you give the lorry driver a delivery note. He drives off to Germany or somewhere and he delivers the goods and come back the next day. That's pretty simple. If the alternative is you have to produce a lot of documents, export documentation and so on, import documentation, and then you give all this to the driver and he drives off to Calais, and he may be held up in Calais for a few hours or maybe even a day or so, and then he gets across and he delivers his goods and he goes back to Calais, and there's a great big queue of 10 miles because there's all sorts of problems with documents in Calais, and lorries being held up in Calais again and so on, and he's maybe there for hours or possibly even days waiting, and he drives back to wherever he came from. It's pretty obvious to a supplier who has those two customers to choose from, which one they're going to choose, and it's perfectly easy to understand why they're pretty reluctant, if there's any shortage at all, to waste their time with the UK. You know, we're very much a second-class customer now. And as you'll have seen in the papers and on television and so on, everything is being blamed, particularly by the BBC, who seem to become now the country's Pravda. Everything is blamed on. It's nothing to do with Brexit whatsoever. It is all to do with the weather, terrible weather in Spain. That's what's causing all these shortages. Why our supermarkets got all these big gaps on them. But for anybody who looks at Twitter, if you look at Twitter over the last few days, maybe I've seen maybe 100 pictures of supermarkets absolutely full of everything you could possibly think of, including plenty of tomatoes in just about every country in Europe. There are no shortages in Europe at all. And you know, there's a veteran reporter called John Sweeney, excellent, brilliant guy, who's now living in Kyiv. He's been there for quite a long time. He did a piece to camera this morning and put it on Twitter, showing a supermarket he stood in Kyiv, full of oranges and tomatoes and everything you could think of. And even Lindsay Hilsum, the Channel 4's foreign correspondent, sent a picture from Kherson, you know, which is almost on the frontier with the fighting, showing supermarkets full of fruit and vegetables. And so what we're being fobbed off with, because nothing can be blamed on Brexit, we're being told now it's the weather. They can't blame these shortages of fruit and vegetables on COVID anymore, and they can't blame it on Putin, but it's the weather. It's the weather in Spain. In fact, the dreadful Theresa Coffey, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, she actually said rather sarcastically in Parliament the other day, she said, we can't control the weather in Spain. And what is so sad is because the BBC and a lot of the press go along all this rubbish, people believe it. They say, oh, well, we'll have to do with that and so on, and we've done worse. We are so conditioned to being just fobbed off by this dishonest, awful government. And you just wonder where, sooner or later, the penny's going to drop. These people are just conning us and lying to us. Brexit is a disaster. And when pressed further, Theresa Coffey, when she's asked a bit more about it, she says, what's actually happening? She says, I'm led to believe by my officials, after discussion with industry and retailers, we anticipate the situation will last about another 2 to 4 weeks. As I've said, there are pictures all over Twitter of supermarkets all over Europe full of stuff. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to be short of tomatoes and all this other stuff. She then says, it's important that we try and make sure we get different sourcing options. You see, we don't have to buy from the EU. We could buy from Chile. Get our tomatoes from Chile. Get them from Australia. We're bringing our lamb there, aren't we? And that's why the department has already been in discussion with retailers, and why there will be further discussions led by ministers as well. Can you imagine one of these dopey ministers working for Theresa Coffey going along to a supermarket and saying, have you thought of sorting somewhere else? And you imagine a buyer for one of these supermarkets employing thousands of people in the buying department who knows absolutely everything there is to know about vegetables and fruit and all the rest of it and sourcing. And imagine going along and saying, have you thought of buying somewhere else? And them saying, well, oh, it's a good idea. Where do you think? Well, where should we look? It's just pathetic. And not only that, I mean, something many people probably don't realise is that, all over Europe they're laughing at us. The German press wrote an article about the shortage of food yesterday. There was another one in the French press about laughing about and showing pictures of empty supermarket shelves. It's just so humiliating. It's so pathetic. This is from a newspaper called Murcia Today in Spain, and it says here, EU countries rely on each other when problems hit and rapidly shift around supply chains. Outside the EU, the UK is on its own. This is a lady tweeting this morning from Holland. She says, I live in the Netherlands. We have too many tomatoes. We used to export them to the UK, but it now takes a truck driver up to 77 hours of queuing to take a load of tomatoes to the UK, and all the truck drivers simply refuse. You see, that's another thing. Lorry drivers aren't going to want to come here. I mean, why would they? Yeah, if you're a lorry driver and you know you've got a trip to Germany and back, you're going to be back tomorrow night, leave first thing in the morning, you're back tomorrow night. But if, on the other hand, you come to the UK, you might be away for a week, I mean, they don't want to do it. They're not going to want to do it. We're a very, very unattractive customer. And as I say, I think inevitably we're going to be at the back of the queue for all these things. You know, there may well have been some bad weather in Spain. I don't doubt that for one moment, and it may well have affected harvest. But supposing 10% of the harvest was damaged, that's 10% of your customers you can't supply. Well, which ones are you going to choose? You're going to choose the difficult ones. I mean, I know from my own experience in business, if you've got 100 customers and you've got 2 or 3 who are just very difficult, they always argue, or they're always difficult to get to, or, you know, you've got to park somewhere and it's difficult to park, and you don't really want that customer. You won't actually get rid of them, but you know, if you're short of stock, that's the one you're going to leave out. And this is what's happening now. We are just an unattractive customer, and I think we're being laughed at, we're being mocked, we're not taken very seriously, and the government is just trying to cover it all up. The response of the government to any criticism whatsoever is either to say it's all to do with COVID, Putin, or Ramonas, or alternatively they just say it's just as bad everywhere else. And now what they're saying with all this business with the shortage of fruit and vegetables, they're saying it's just about everywhere, and it isn't. They're lying to you, as they lie to you all the time, because they're a dishonest government, thanks to the example set by Boris Johnson. It's all a terrible mess, and it's all a great shame. And I think, you know, we should be aware of this, the likelihood that there are going to be further shortages, because you know, whatever products it may be, not necessarily food or fruit and vegetables and so on, but whatever it is going to be, it might be computer chips, it might be all sorts of different things, it might be fertilizer, but we're going to be the ones who are going to be at the end of the queue when it comes to allocating limited merchandise in future. That's your Brexit. But anyway, that's what I think about it. If you've watched this far, thank you very much as always, and till next time, bye for now.